So people watching at home, we just finished question 1 about the front matter, dedication, and epigraph. The dedication mentions that it's dedicated to the noble people of the land between the two rivers, the ordinary people, not a specific government or a specific side in the war. And the epigraph is about children dying and then very ironically being called infant martyrs. And we just talked about how if you put these two together, it seems like this novel will be a criticism of war, regardless of what reasons people use to begin it or to fight it. Okay, moving on to question 2. How would you describe the Americans in this novel so far? And why would you describe them this way? So to answer this question, we can do a very quick text search, right? Let's see where we find the Americans. Okay, maybe not that fast. Why does it go from the start? Okay, yeah, so the first mention we have is on page 2. Our main character, Saleh, is in the middle of a firefight, and he's thinking about how people in Iran and in the Arabic countries of the Middle East think about this war. Here he's thinking about the relationship between Iran and the Arabic countries. Syria and Iraq were deep Arab lands that may have needed us just then to stop the enemy, but they didn't want us. They didn't love us. Yet we were there, equipped with some bullshit reason about protecting the holy sites of Mesopotamia from the desecrations of the common enemy. This made us suspect, even to ourselves. Okay, so he's saying because this reason sounds so fake, even the people who say these words don't really believe them. And often I wondered if our pretense was not worse than that of the Americans, who variously drop bombs on the enemy and on us and put it all down to saving civilization. So uh, here he's comparing the Iranian position to the American position. The Iranians are saying we must defend the holy sites, whereas the Americans say we have to save civilization. Not even defend civilization, but to save it. Like we have already lost it and we have to bring it back again. Um, and because of this reason, the Americans drop bombs on everybody, on the enemy, on, it says, the Iranians. So it seems like the Americans are behaving in a way that feels like they don't really understand what's going on. Like they see videos of terrorists blowing themselves up and cutting off people's heads, and they think that's terrible, we have to stop them. But it feels like they don't really understand the relationships between the people in the region. Don't really understand what the people in the region really care about. The way they talk, it seems like the Middle East doesn't have civilization, and so America has to come in and save it. Or perhaps that the Middle East can't save themselves and that America needs to come in and help. And then today we also have another mention of the Americans on page 3. This is the same section actually. At least the Americans, for all their bluster and spine-chilling gunships, did not cram belief down anyone's throat. We did, or we tried. So here we have a description of the American, I guess, military. Their bluster, which means that they talk big talk. They say big words. And then it has their spine-chilling gunships. And this is a description of American military power. Like even when you see one of their gunships, it makes you feel fear that other military power does not. So we can summarize this part as saying the Americans talk big and they shoot big as well. And so here our main character is saying, even though the Americans have the attitude and have the power, they did not force people to believe something else. And then he says that Iran does. Apparently, when Iran uses its military power, it's trying to spread its influence, it's trying to convert more people to believing that Iran is a good force in the region, that kind of thing. Whereas, according to our main character, the Americans simply want you to stop fighting and to settle down and maybe try democracy, but doesn't seem to try to force people to change their ideas. Um, I guess apparently the Americans have given up on trying to persuade people in the Middle East that America is a good force instead of a bad one. Like we all know that Iran and many other Middle Eastern countries don't really like the United States. And apparently the Americans have kind of accepted that. They don't really try to change people's minds about them. Right? If we look at the previous paragraph, they have one mission, and it is to save civilization. They don't really care if you like them when they try to do that. Okay, do we have another mention this week? Yes, we do. So this is on page 5. So here, Saleh is talking about finding a copy of the final volume of Remembrance of Things Past, and thinking about why. Why would an Iranian soldier, or apparently a soldier, it turns out he's a TV reporter, but why would this Iranian, in the middle of a war, be carrying around an English translation of a Frenchman's book and then leave it here in a ruined building? And Saleh says, why? I had an inkling, which means maybe I have an idea. Once I'd read an American writer who said that you can tell a true war story if you just keep on telling it. In this war, nothing at all made sense. So these two sentences seem to be contradicting each other. If nothing makes sense, then if you try to tell a true story about it, then your story would not make sense, right? It would be a record of nonsense. Although I guess that kind of does make sense to say that in order to record this nonsense, all you have to do is keep on talking, keep on writing. And of course, there's a reason that it mentions an American writer. It's because this is a real quotation from somebody, and the person is American. But the word American or American writer here is also doing other work. It also gives us different meanings in addition to simply saying the writer was American. Just like it mentions an English translation of a Frenchman's book. Yes, Remembrance of Things Past is a French book. And yes, the title means that it's been translated into English. But mentioning an English translation of a Frenchman's book in the middle of the war makes it sound more absurd. We are in the Middle East, quite far away from Europe and France. We're even further away from America. And yet, even here, we can find a cultural artifact from those places. So, on the one hand, we have the idea of like Western cultural power. Even in this most unlikeliest of places, you can still find this kind of thing. In order to understand why, our main character appeals to an American writer, not an Iranian writer, not an Arabic writer. So here too, we see kind of like the cultural power of the West. And then the idea that you can tell a true war story if you just keep on telling it. I don't know about you, but to me, that sounds very American. The idea that if you keep going, it'll work, something will happen. We can imagine other cultures might think first you have to make a plan, you have to prepare, you have to know what you're doing. But no, this American writer says just keep going, it'll work out. So we can also combine this with the previous mention of the Americans. Their military also doesn't seem to understand what's really going on. They just come in, see bad guys, bomb them, and then say we're saving civilization. Or not even bad guys, but see people they think are bad guys. Okay, do we have another mention of Americans? Same thing, so nothing new here. And then near the end of this week's selection, page 17, Saleh's interrogator H asks him to write a TV pilot. TV pilot is basically the script for the first episode of a TV show, and you use that script to try to get somebody to buy your show. And H says, write about Baghdad circa 2006, which means around that time. Write about the Americans, make them as bad as you can. Okay, so in the previous examples, we saw how the author, the main character thinks about American military and American writers. Here we have an example of how the Iranian government thinks of American military and American government. Or maybe not how they really think, but how they use the idea of America as their enemy to create propaganda for people to watch on TV. Every story needs an antagonist, someone who opposes or tries to stop or goes against the main character, the protagonist. And for the Iranian state TV, apparently their most popular antagonist is the Americans. When we watch American action movies, the bad guys are very vaguely Russian or vaguely Arabic. We don't really know where they're from. We don't really understand a lot about their history. That's kind of what the Iranian state TV is doing as well, except instead of Russians and Arabic people, they are using Americans and Western people as the bad guys. Kind of fun, right? And Saleh, of course, understands what's going on. He's a writer. He has written for TV before. He knows the structure of the story. But he doesn't object. He says, well, they weren't exactly angels. When H says, make them as bad as you can, he implies that maybe the Americans were not actually that bad. They weren't probably good, but they weren't probably that bad. That's why he has to tell Saleh to make them as bad as you can. And Saleh says, well, they weren't exactly angels. So for him, it won't be that hard. And then H continues, don't interrupt. Baghdad 2006. Scenario. Our guys have a few operatives in there, a few soldiers there, or like agents. You'll need one main guy, a hero, in charge of, well, you know the rest, right? So both of these people understand how TV works. And then Saleh points out the key idea of this discussion. Your people need a TV series about us against the Americans? Is that why I'm here today? So for me, the key word here is need. The Iranian state TV needs this TV show. It's not just entertainment, there is a purpose, and that purpose is probably propaganda, maybe even distraction. If you have a good TV show, people will pay more attention to that and less attention to how bad their own lives are. Especially if you can create like a common enemy. When you're too busy hating one group of people, you won't have the attention and energy to focus on what's wrong in your own life. Is often what happens. Okay, so those are all the mentions of Americans in this week's selection. So, how would you describe these Americans? As like powerful outsiders with a big attitude who don't really understand the details of what's going on, but because they are so powerful, they cannot be ignored. So for Iran, instead of trying to ignore the Americans, they turn the Americans into the standard bad guys of their propaganda TV shows. I think that kind of describes what's going on, right? Okay. I think it's interesting to because as we talked about the influence of Western media in Taiwan, we're also often watching American shows and movies and reading American stories. So I think it's quite interesting to see how a part of the world that doesn't like the United States describes Americans. Other thoughts or questions about number two? All right, let's move on to number three. Why do you think the war gave each man his purpose, a shape to a life that otherwise would be meaningless, toiling away at hollow jobs back home, if nothing at all made sense about it? So this question has two parts. The first part is, how does war give people a sense of shape and meaning to their life? And the second part is, okay, but what if the war itself is nonsense? Does it still work like that? So let's see if we can get more information from this section, page 5. Here it is. So here he's again talking about the remembrance of things past. And he's saying that the book describes how war actually gave each man his purpose. The quote that I just read earlier. We would all die here sooner or later. It was what we did. I use we generously, however, and when I say it, I don't mean myself, I mean the fighters. They did not have to be here, not one of them. They came voluntarily. Even if they were paid, even if they knew Syria's bad faith would eventually send them home if they did fall into enemy hands in a casket. A casket is a coffin. So something about war, maybe even this war, draws people to want to fight, even if it means that they would most likely die. So why? What is it about war that kind of seems better than spending day after day working at your same meaningless job at home? How does war give people a sense of purpose? Well, it talks about jobs, but I think this logic could also apply to taking classes, which I'm sure you are more familiar with. Like, think about what you do every year. 2 semesters, each semester 16 to 18 weeks. Every week you come to class, you listen to the teacher blabber about something, you try to remember enough to pass the exams, and then you go on summer vacation or winter vacation. Why? Why are you doing this? So that you can get a diploma and get a job and go to work every day and do what your boss tells you so you can get enough money to buy food? That sounds kind of sad, right? So on the one hand, that's the meaningless jobs part. But what about war? How is war different? You come to class basically so that in the future you won't starve to death. But war seems opposite. Why do people volunteer for something that could get them killed? Why? So if we take this war as an example, the Iranians say we're defending the holy sites. The Americans say they're saving civilization. And we don't see it here, but the enemy says we're doing it so that everybody can follow the correct teachings of Islam according to them. So it's not just about living, right? It seems to be about some higher meaning, religious faith, or faith in the value of human civilization. Whatever the reason, it always seems to be about something bigger than your own self, bigger than simply surviving from day to day. And for people who actually believe those reasons, that could be a strong motivator, right? Why am I wasting my life in order to live when I could live for something more important, even if it's a shorter life? Like, the idea seems to be that even if I join this war and I live to come home, I'm still coming home to a meaningless job or meaningless classes. So it's no different from dying. I might as well die in the war. It doesn't make a difference. And for fighters who have a religious faith, especially in this story, Iranians who are faithful Muslims, dying is not the same as coming home to a meaningless job. It's better because if you die for a religious reason, you get to go to heaven. And the Iranian government will give money to your family and name like a street after you. So this seems to be the logic of the first part of this question. How war gives people purpose and a shape to their life. But there's another part to this question, which is uh, nothing, nothing at all makes sense in this war. Does that change your ideas about the first half of this question? If I go to war because I believe in some higher meaning, and I go and I join and I fight and I realize nothing makes sense, how does that change me? If that higher purpose no longer feels real, then I'm living my same meaningless life, except now it could be shorter. Seems like the logic would be different, right? Seems like people who feel like the war is actually nonsense would be less willing to keep fighting. And so first we see earlier in the story the Afghan soldiers, most of them are mercenaries, which means they're being paid. So for them, it's their job. And that's why the first scene of the story is the Afghans kind of give up the house that they're supposed to be defending. Maybe they feel like they're not being paid enough. Maybe they feel like dying in this house is not worth the money. So their behavior is different because they treat war as a job and not as like a meaningful thing to do. And then the other example of this attitude that this war makes no sense is, of course, our main character. He's the person who says this. He's the person who thinks that this war is bullshit. So that idea of like everybody around him has, or especially the Iranians around him, believe that this war has a higher purpose, but he himself does not. That kind of attitude, I think we can feel throughout the story when he's describing situations, when he's describing his own behavior. Already this week, we saw him binge drinking for 14 days. We see him eating too much protein. We see him kind of playfully arguing with his interrogator. You can kind of feel like he has a kind of cynical attitude toward what's happening. Like it doesn't really mean anything, and everybody who thinks it means something is an idiot. But he's still writing, or I should say, he's still doing his job as a journalist. He still wants to go to Syria to pick up a gun and fight. If he thinks that this war is nonsense, why does he keep on wanting to go to Syria? You have any ideas? So soldiers throughout history have often discovered that what their leaders and commanders believe in is often bullshit. But there is still a meaning in war, and that meaning is your comrades. Earlier, we had a scene where Saleh and Moalem retake that house. And um, later, they have backup from the Afghans who earlier retreated. And after they defend the house, we have a scene of the soldiers congratulating each other. Let's see, where is it? Um, Here, page 8. It was so like now they are bombing the enemies who are trying to take the house. It was deafening like always. And when it was done, all I knew was that something in our dynamic had changed. Something in our relationship had changed. The plucky, formidable Afghans who had been guilted into coming back to their positions were kissing Moalem. Then they were doing the same to me. So something about this battle brings them closer together. And then later, the young men only knew that somehow we, two old timers pushing middle age, saved the day by just being here. They needed to believe in our courage, to believe in their own. So people who no longer believe in the stated reasons for a war often find meaning in their comrades and companions in the middle of the war. I protect you, you protect me. We have a strong bond based on our shared desire to stay alive throughout the war and hopefully to achieve some kind of success. Perhaps that is why our main character, who doesn't believe in the war, continues going back and joining up with the fighting. Other thoughts or questions about number 3? All right, let's take a longer break. Please come back at 10:15. All right, let's move on to question 4. How do you explain the idea of a sunset with a deeper shade of blood orange that made partings not just possible, but necessary? So this is on page 9. Saleh is remembering the last time he came to Damascus, the capital of Syria, to visit the Zainab shrine. I'd first been to the Zainab just before the war began, with a woman whose love bled us both. So apparently his relationship with this woman was not a healthy one. It seems like they both loved each other very much, but that they simply were not compatible people. So he describes it as um, her love bled us both. Or maybe she loved him more than he loved her, because he's describing the love as hers. When she took my photograph by the citadel, I knew I was going to leave. The realization came at a moment of perfect beauty as the Damascene sky. By the way, Damascene, of course, is the adjective for Damascus, but it also describes a color. As the Damascene sky shifted at sunset to a deeper shade of blood orange that made partings not just possible, but necessary. So it's sunset. It's a deeper shade of orange. It's blood orange. So I guess it's between orange and red. A really beautiful sunset, a perfect beauty. And he says that this beautiful sunset didn't just make the fact that he was going to leave her possible, it made it necessary. What could this mean? Well, going into this scene, he was already feeling kind of bad about their relationship. And, you know, when you feel like you want to leave someone, you have to think about the right moment. You can't just like disappear. It's very impolite. I mean, you can, but it's not a very good thing to do. So often people think like it's a good idea to leave on a high note, to leave after like a beautiful memory. Other people think it's better to leave after a bad experience, like a fight. Apparently, Saleh is one of those people who thinks that it's better to leave after a good moment. So imagine this scene. He's with a woman who loves him very much. They're visiting a holy site. She takes his picture in front of a beautiful, beautiful sunset, perfectly beautiful. What could be a better moment than that? So if Saleh believes that it's better to break up with someone after a good moment, this would be the perfect moment after which to break up with her. All right. So to him, it makes partings not just possible, but necessary. He has to do it now because there will be no better experience to create another moment. The idea that some moments in life are kind of like made for you to do things. It's one version of the idea of fate. Some people think of fate in a fatalistic way, like, oh, it happened, I couldn't do anything about it, it was fate. But there's another way to think of fate, which is some people think they're waiting for the universe to tell them what to do or when to do it, waiting for a sign from the universe. Another word for this is kismet, which means like it's the right moment for something to happen. And apparently, Saleh believes in that kind of fate. Like maybe like you have a decision that you're trying to make, or maybe you have already made the decision and you're thinking about when you should begin taking action. If you believe in this kind of thing, then you might be waiting for the perfect moment to choose or the perfect moment to begin. It feels right, right? Or like if you're thinking about whether to, for example, continue trying to do something or whether to give up, if you have a great day where everything goes well for you, you might feel like that's a sign from the universe that you should keep trying. Whereas if you have a terrible day where everything bad happens to you, you might feel like that's a sign telling you that you should give up. So this kind of understanding of fate is apparently behind Saleh's idea of a beautiful evening sunset leading to him breaking up with this woman. There's another idea in this passage as well. We can think of this as the aesthetic life, or the idea that ethics and aesthetics are not two different things. Aesthetics is the study of beauty, or you might say the understanding of beauty. And some people believe that right and wrong ethics is actually based on aesthetics. Something is right because it looks good, it feels good, it seems beautiful, it seems fitting, it seems proper, it seems. It's a perception issue. Whereas something is wrong because it feels ugly, it doesn't seem right, it doesn't fit the situation. Um, so these people often make their decisions based on aesthetic judgments, judgments about what would be beautiful, what would be seemingly better. Whereas I think the more usual means of making ethical judgments is to think about like, would it help people? Would it hurt people? Here, it seems like Saleh is one of those aesthetic people. He's making a decision about when to break up with this woman based on how beautiful the evening is, rather than when would cause the least amount of harm to her, or maybe even when would cause the most amount of harm if he's feeling vengeful. And so this particular scene gives us quite a lot of information about our main character. He believes in waiting for the right moment. He believes in beauty as a guide for behavior. And we know that he's a writer, and that he's a freelance writer. Like he mentions somewhere else that he had written for many different outlets, which at that point, many of them had already closed. So he's not working for one newspaper, he's working for whoever would buy his work. A very flexible and free kind of writer. So this is a story told by this kind of man who believes in aesthetics, who believes in waiting for the right moment, and whose job is to produce good writing. And here he is in the middle of a war, one of the most ugliest, least opportune, least literary of events. So something about this war must feel right to him. There must be some kind of beauty that he perceives in this war. Otherwise, he wouldn't be trying to go back all the time, even going against his interrogator's rules about not going to Syria. As we continue reading this story, I want you to remember that there's something beautiful here, even if it might take some effort to find. So as you read, try to keep an eye out for moments of beauty, whether like visual beauty or ethical beauty, like people behaving in beautiful ways, or maybe even the beauty of beliefs or experiences. In the middle of an ugly war, perhaps there still is some beauty for us to find. Okay, other thoughts or questions about number 4? Okay, if not, let's move on to question 5. H, the interrogator, didn't understand why you couldn't put literature in the service of some greater good, like teaching young men to be more devout or more committed to the state. Devout, of course, means faithful, religiously faithful. And the story describes this idea as the basis of one of their most common arguments or disagreements. Saleh does not believe that literature can do this, whereas H does. But the question here today is, do you think literature can serve a greater good? Why or why not? And if you do believe this, should it? Again, why or why not? So let's take a look at the context of this question first on page 11. Um, well, the context we saw a bit earlier, actually, which is that H wants him to write TV pilot, right? Write about Baghdad, make the Americans the bad guy. So apparently there is some kind of purpose for this design. We were talking about propaganda. We were talking about like distraction for ordinary people to not focus so much on the problems in their own lives, things like that. Um, but on page 11 is when we first meet the interrogator. And I think it's interesting that one of the first things we learn about him is his attitude towards using literature for another purpose. I'll name him H, short for handler, someone who handles people and situations. He was a heavy-set man, kind of a big man, kind despite his job, a man who couldn't fully wrap his will around being a state interrogator, which means like often Saleh feels like H, his heart really isn't in his job. He doesn't fully believe in doing the necessity of doing his job. It wasn't his style. Again, we have the aesthetics. Mostly, when he called me in, we discussed literature. He didn't understand why you couldn't put literature in the service of some greater good, like teaching young men to be more devout or more committed to the state. There was a purpose to everything in his accounting. A guy didn't write stories just for the sake of writing them. They had to strive for something bigger, more meaningful. So our literary interrogations ultimately had a ceiling. There was a point beyond which we could not speak to each other. And that was all right. In the grand scheme of things, H was still preferable to a lot of people in Tehran. He didn't pretend to be anything other than what he was, an agent of the state. His job was to make sure you didn't stray far from certain parameters. So literally his job is to handle Saleh, make sure Saleh doesn't go too far from what the government allows him to do. So it looks like here their main disagreement about literature, or I should just say their main disagreement in general, is whether literature can and should serve a greater good, or whether someone could just write stories for the sake of writing them. What do you think? can literature serve a greater good? Some people are saying yes. So you're probably thinking like, if we tell a story about like a great person and the great things they did, maybe it would inspire other people. Or maybe you're thinking about some of the things that we read in the first half of this semester, which carried ideas about not being lazy, or uh, arguing against war based on the suffering it causes to civilians, or persuading you to care more about refugees. Right? It seems like the literature we have been reading so far has had some ideas in them. The authors do seem to be writing them for some purpose. But saying that an author writes a story for a reason is different from saying that literature can serve a greater good. These authors write for their own reasons, not a greater reason that uh, kind of guides the literature. Usually, a writer writes something because they care about the thing. And the reason they care about the thing is because there is some bigger idea or situation related to the thing. But it's usually the thing first, and then the idea, only to help us understand why they care. Whereas if you look at the example of the TV pilot, first we get write about the Americans, make them as bad as you can, and then we get the basic plot. So here the idea comes first, and then the story, which is the reverse of how we usually think about literature. So this apparently would be an example of literature serving a greater good. Is TV literature? Could be, right? There's writing, and there's like beauty or judgments about beauty. There's a story. Could be literature. So if this is our example of literature serving a greater good, could this process produce good literature? If you begin with the idea and then you create a story to support, explain, or justify that idea, could you get a good piece of literature? Maybe, but compared to the other process where you begin with the thing that the author cares about and then only add in ideas to help us understand, to me at least, it feels like that process would give us better literature, more likely. I think the fact that we're talking about TV here is quite fitting. The idea of literature serving a greater good, or like literature that goes idea first. This is more common in film and television, mainly because those are efforts that need a group of people. It's possible, but very hard to make a movie yourself with nobody else. It usually takes dozens, if not hundreds of people. So how do you keep everybody doing the same thing? How do you make sure you're all working to create the same thing and not like everybody is creating their own different idea of this story? Usually, you do it by making sure that the idea of the story is very clear for every person. And that's why you often have idea-led stories in film and television. It's a way to help them be more efficient and productive in creating the work. But again, that's not always the case. Sometimes you do have more artistic directors and writers who are able to communicate the feeling or the thing that they want to express. And everybody understands that, and they end up making a movie that has ideas but is not dominated by those ideas. A different way to approach this question is the question of political correctness. As I'm sure you've seen before, often people will say they didn't like this movie because it was like too woke. It was trying to be politically correct. For example, there was a character who was black for no reason, apparently because the director or the artist wanted to promote an idea of diversity, something like that, that is not related to the main story. This kind of criticism is criticism of literature serving a greater good, an idea-led work of literature. A good work of literature in this example wouldn't just make a character black. They would create a character that only makes sense if they are black. And you could say that that would be an example of true diversity, not just changing the skin color of a person. Of course, that argument, that debate is a lot bigger than just one idea. There's also elements related to employment opportunities, visibility, representation, and like how much influence an actor has over their character, things like that. But simply on the one point of in the script, should this character be a specific race? The idea seems to be it should be to make the work itself more meaningful and not simply to make sure that you have actors of different races in the same production. So we've discussed two examples of literature serving a greater good, one to create Iranian propaganda, the other one to promote diversity on screen. And in both cases, it seems like this process of literature serving a greater good is less likely to produce good literature. Not impossible, but less likely. The opposite viewpoint that Saleh has is that a writer should be able to write for the sake of writing. There doesn't need to be a message that the writer has to promote. The writer simply wants to write about this. And like writing for the sake of writing, it's a bit of a simple way to say this. But basically it's an author should be able to write about whatever they want to write about. And this does not mean like they can write about or that they will write about whatever. Usually writers only write about things that they want to write about in this framework. So that goes back to like different writers have different reasons for writing about things. Different artists have different reasons. And the idea seems to be that we should not force or guide writers to only write about to only write for specific reasons. Even if we don't force them to, even if the government is saying, hey, we will give you more money if you write about this, Saleh seems to be saying that this would be a bad thing. Can you think about why? I mean, the most obvious possibility is, what if the thing that the government wants you to write about is not a good thing? In our first example, Iranian propaganda making the Americans the bad guy. Like, I'm not even talking about making the Americans the bad guy, but making any country the bad guy does not seem to be a good thing. If you remember, like a few years ago, Top Gun Maverick, who were the bad guys in that one? A terrorist organization, right? So we're not saying any one country is a bad guy. Seems to be a better thing to do. So yeah, the biggest objection is, what if the government wants you to write about something that is not good? Okay, but what if the thing the government wants you to write about is good? Like our second example, promoting diversity. It's a good thing, right? So why could it be not a good idea for the government to say, hey, we'll give you more money if you write a story with diverse people? Think about this. You are a writer. You have an idea. You care about this thing and you want to write about it. But you don't have a lot of money. You want to stay alive. And the government is saying, if you write about that, we'll give you more money. It's quite possible that you would set your own idea aside and write about what the government wants first. And maybe that will get you enough money to come back and do your own thing, but maybe not. Maybe you will find yourself continuing to write about the thing that brings you more money. So even though in this situation, nobody is forcing you to write about something, simply the fact that the government wants or prefers some kind of writing has a negative influence on your writing about what you want to write about. Yeah, we're talking about incentive structures, basically. So apparently this is what Saleh is talking about. You can't put literature in the service of some greater good. Because if you do, then you sacrifice other kinds of literature. Yes, art is infinite and eternal. People can make art about whatever. But people are finite and mortal with a limited time on this earth. And that has a material influence on how art develops. So those are the ideas in their disagreement. But we can also see how this disagreement helps us understand these two characters. Saleh, as we previously talked about, is a man of aesthetics, a writer who believes in waiting for the right moment to do things. Having a government tell him, why don't you write about this, is kind of opposite to how he lives his own life. Right? When H proposes that he write about a TV show, his response is, you want me to do that? Right? It's not what he's looking for. It doesn't fit with his picture of his own life. Whereas for H, who is a state interrogator, his job is to talk with people and make sure that they are not working against the government, to make sure that these people are all following the rules. And of course, everybody who talks to a state interrogator knows that this is his job. So if they are doing things that the government might not like, they would try to hide them. So part of the state interrogator's job is to find out what people don't want to tell you. In other words, to treat all the information you get as clues toward information that you want. So this is where you get the idea that if you say something wrong to a police officer, it may lead to a big negative consequence later down the road. So here we're not just talking about state interrogators, we're also talking about police interrogators, even in democratic countries like Taiwan. Most people think that the job of the police is to solve crimes and catch bad guys. technically speaking, only the first part is true. The job of the police is to solve crimes. The person they catch, if that person goes to trial and is found guilty, then this person is, by definition, a bad guy. But that does not mean that they actually did the thing. So the police's job is to solve crimes. They want to find a person to solve their crime. And it would be great if that person was actually the person. But even if it's not, as long as they get convicted, the police are happy. So when talking to a police officer, you should remember that their first goal is not the truth. Their first goal is a story that will convince the judge. And that's what's going on with this interrogator as well. He doesn't really care about what Saleh thinks or what Saleh believes. He only cares that Saleh not break the rules and not work against the government. So for him, everything Saleh does, everything Saleh says has a purpose. There was a purpose to everything in his accounting. And that's why in this first discussion, they get a very absurd questioning about like, why did you bury this book? Let's see, where is it? Here. Why did you bury the book in Iraq? We have read Saleh's account of this incident. We know why he buried the book. And the answer is he felt like it. It felt like the right thing to do. There's no real reason. But of course, no reason is not acceptable to a state interrogator. That's why they're having this discussion. So their ideas about literature kind of reflect their beliefs about life as well. Saleh, who feels like artists should be able to do whatever feels right and beautiful, believes that writers should be able to write for the sake of writing, write whatever they want. H, who believes that everybody is trying to hide something and people are trying to break the rules, and his job is to stop them, believes that literature must serve a greater purpose, that there must be a reason for everything. So it kind of fits, right? But ultimately, this discussion question is about you. What do you think about literature? I think I've presented both sides quite clearly. We have read literature with ideas. So the question becomes a personal one. Do you think it is more important for an author to express what is important for themselves? Or is it more important for art to help in serving society in some way? And I will leave that one up to you. I think this is a question that might take you a bit of a period of time to come to an answer. Okay, so that's today's discussion. Do you have other thoughts or questions? Okay, before next week, please finish up to the end of chapter 5. I know it looks like this week we read 2 chapters and next week you have to read 3, but I try to keep the page counts around the same. So the next 3 chapters will be slightly shorter. So before next week, please finish up to the end of chapter 5. It looks like we're missing some people today. Let's take attendance.